Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Thursday Fireside Chat with Lyndon LaRouche for July 8th. I think many of you are aware that we held a conference about 10 days ago, a two-day conference, which was intended to address several matters of great import, and they are matters that many other people are beginning to address. This week, we have a contrasting view in the world. We have the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan, sometimes called the graveyard of empires. And we have, on the other side, an extraordinary event occurring in China involving 160 countries, 500 political parties, and about 16 heads of state, about which, of course, very little is being said. Helga Zepp LaRouche was interviewed by China Radio International about these events and did participate along with our French organization, our Swedish organization, and others. And the importance is simply to indicate the two paths that are before humanity. In the case of Afghanistan, the United States, after spending 20 years there, which was an extraordinary mistake, left under cover of darkness, not informing their allies, the Afghan military, of their final motion. And this has been satirized and criticized and denounced and so on. But we apparently spent 20 years trying to win the democracy in the hearts and minds of people who we so distrusted at the end. We didn't even let them know exactly how and when we were leaving. That strategy, that policy, can be laid squarely at the feet of persons such as the late Zbigniew Brzezinski, the still extant Henry Kissinger, and the perhaps never truly living Bernard Lewis, not well known. He is now officially deceased. He was a British intelligence agent who was in residence at Princeton University and was the originator of something called the Arc of Crisis policy back in the 1970s. And this was a policy that the United States government was caused to follow for 40 years. It was completely bankrupt and destructive and has significantly bankrupted and destroyed not only the countries in which it's been used, but the United States itself. Ostensibly, we went there because of 9/11. And, of course, we are coming up on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, this coming September 11th. It's important to recognize that the Russians, then the Soviet Union, spent 10 unproductive years, one decade in Afghanistan as well. And what they essentially got out of it was a heroin addiction problem that was made worse after they left by the United States presence together with the presence of the British. There were others. It was a NATO war. The opium crop became horrifically larger. And the Russians attempted to organize the United States to oppose this by doing a kind of an aerial bombardment of the opium crop. The U.S. did not agree to that. More notably, 11 years ago, when the state of California began to talk about legalizing marijuana, it was Viktor Ivanov, who was the head of the Russian anti-narcotics program, flew to Los Angeles to meet with the mayor, Villaraigosa at the time, the sheriff, and others to demand that California not legalize. And much could be said about this, but what he said at the time was, quote, "I'm afraid that the consequences of legalization will be catastrophic. Even the Netherlands, where they sell marijuana legally in coffee shops, they are now reversing on this because there and everywhere drug addiction is becoming stronger, and the people who are addicted develop psychiatric deviations. Some have heard this saying: what does God do when he wants to punish a person? He deprives him of his mind. Now, the first panel of our conference was called Whom the Gods Would Destroy. War with China and Russia is worse than mad. Whom the gods would destroy, they first drive mad is a proverb attributed to many different people. But in the case of the United States and what has been happening in our country in the last few years, what you see is that there is no longer a value of the sacredness of the human mind. And the idea that you do not legalize drugs because drugs adversely affect the mind is no longer agreed upon by the people of the United States. If you don't have agreement on that, you can have no national purpose that can ensure the future of your country or your people. It is impossible. This is not a question of so-called preference. It's a question of recognizing that you create conditions for the social expression of mass psychosis, the sort of thing we've seen, which people try to explain away in cities like New York, but we see it all over the suburbs of the United States as well. And you see it in all kinds of other activities, including many of the peculiar activities, the multiple genders and the other things, peculiar activities of school principals and people in other parts of other offices because of what has become a practice of so-called recreational drug use. But it's something much more fundamental than drug use. That's just an expression of something. The Russians recognized they had 30,000 per year dying of heroin overdoses. This is back, we're talking 11 years ago. When you look at the United States opioid deaths plus other drug deaths, you look at the despair that expresses itself. What you're watching is the self-destruction of the United States that was caused to take upon itself a Malthusian set of values. A set of values in which it was said that there are too many people, including too many people in the United States. That, for example, the idea that we would have an economic policy that would be forecasting that there would be 500 to 700 million people living in the United States, if you propose that right now, sounds completely preposterous. It sounds like something that's actually socially irresponsible. And it's to the degree to which that is believed that the United States is doomed. Because resources, natural resources, the greatest natural resource there is for economy and economic progress are human beings. Not oil, not coal, not fossil fuels, not gold, not diamonds, not real estate, not farmland. The greatest source of actual physical wealth. I'm not talking about now something that's supposed to be poetic or metaphorical, but the actual greatest source of the physical transformation of wealth is the human mind. That's a new kind of economics. It was an economics that Jason LaRouche pioneered. He was not the first person to ever talk about it, but he was the most explicit about the relationship between human creativity and physical productivity. So that, for example, in today's United States, approximately, let's say that's well over 70% of our people are engaged in non-productive activities. They may be socially necessary in some cases, but they are not, strictly speaking, productive. That means physical productivity like we used to have during the Second World War, or we had in the 1950s, when we had factories all over this country employing 25,000 people and 45,000 people down at the docks in Baltimore, so forth and so on. When we made things, when we were proud of what we made, when we created cities, we walked away from this, or were caused to walk away from this starting in the 1970s, pretty much coterminous with the Vietnam War, and the withdrawal from Afghanistan is reminiscent of nothing so much as the ignominious withdrawal of the United States in April of 1975 from Vietnam, of which, it's now 46 years ago. So what we are concerned to do with our conferences, and we're having a few of them, we'll announce those after our presentation this evening, what we're just concerned to do is we're not going to have a great reset like they talk about, with global warming. We want to have a mental reset. We want to have our people reverse their axioms, look at the axioms of failure that are driving us into the hands of death, the jaws of death, in which when we have our own American Revolution celebration, as we did last Saturday, Americans don't even read the Declaration of Independence. We're prepared to reverse that. And we've got a very particular approach to that, and that is to say, mankind is the primary resource. All of this business about global warming, limits of resources, pollution of the planet, carbon dioxide is the enemy. This is all to be fundamentally rejected. And, of course, we may have to, therefore, equip our citizens with a way to do that, with the ideas required to do that. So at our conference 12 days ago, we had a panel 2, which was said that, why the world needs that 7 terawatts, but actually many more terawatts than that of energy, and why, this idea of climate change and the way in which it's being described is psychologically, mentally, scientifically incompetent. We're going to be having another conference in about 17 days, I guess it is, on July 24th. And we're going to attack this issue because you have all these blackouts going on in the United States today. And we want to use this as the occasion to take an assembly of scientists that Jason may tell you a bit about. We started with 12 days ago. And the scientists plus trade unionists plus farm leaders plus state legislators from around our country that are fighting this get together. And we're going to take this on and take it on in a way that we win. And we don't let people die because they're not allowed to have air conditioning because we're closing our nuclear power plants. We're not going to have people die because the hospital doesn't have enough electricity, even if they have backup electricity, because we're using wind power instead of using coal. We've got to revolt against that. And more than that, we want to have a completely different orientation toward the rest of the world, working with China, Russia, India, Japan, other countries, in a set of initiatives that take the human mind as the primary source of wealth and then use that around what we call our World Health Platform, which is a kind of metaphorically our approach to solving this whole problem. So we're going to have Jason Ross now from the LaRouche science team, and he'll take us through this conception. Then we'll go to questions and answers afterwards. So, Jason?
Okay. Hey, thanks, Dennis. So to listen to what the legacy media are telling us, the New York Times, the Washington Post, trash like that, if they're right, climate change is going to worsen natural disasters, cause sea levels to rise, degrade our land, spread deserts, cause long-lasting or irreversible harm, as they've said. Floods, droughts, storms, and other types of extreme weather threaten to disrupt and over time shrink the global food supply, we're warned. About 5, 6, 7 years ago, we were warned that there was a tipping point, that we were reaching a point of no return on the climate. In 2019, a NASA scientist told the New York Times about the potential risk of multi-bread basket failure, which is not actually a technical term or anything. A 2019 report from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or at least its summary for policymakers, said that the window to address the threat of climate change is closing rapidly. We've seen fires in California. Noted expert Leonardo DiCaprio said, the reason these wildfires have worsened is because of climate change. Noted expert on everything, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, said, this is what climate change looks like. Bill McKibben, a noted climate activist, said, what we're playing for now is to see if we can limit climate change to the point where we don't wipe out civilizations. And at the moment, we're headed in a direction where that won't happen. That's what we're told. And what's the deadline? Well, we got told that deadline recently by scoldy teenager Greta Thunberg. She said in the year 2030, in 10 years, 250 days, and 10 hours, very precise, we will be in a position where we set off an irreversible chain reaction beyond human control that will most likely lead to the end of our civilization as we know it. I don't want you to be hopeful. I want you to panic, she said in 2019. Now, where does this 12 years thing, 2030, where did this even come from? Okay, so the IPCC itself had said that in order to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, CO2 emissions would have to decline by a certain amount by 2030. That's all they said. Even the IPCC didn't say there would be an irreversible chain reaction. They just said it would be more than 1.5 degrees warmer. Now, let's leave aside whether the IPCC is even right about that. Let's set aside the science on climate, which is extremely complex, and we shouldn't be lectured on it by people who don't know much about it. Because overall, our relationship to the climate is one of increasing independence. The climate matters less and less and less over the span of human civilization because we're humans. That's not true for animals, but it's true for us. In the 1920s, during that decade, over 5 million people died from extreme weather, from natural disasters. In the last decade, the 2010s, it was less than 500,000, even though there were 4 times as many people on the planet. That's an enormous decrease. Did the climate get better than in the 1920s? No. Look, let me ask you, what is the biggest impact on whether someone's going to freeze to death in the winter? A temperature change of 1 or 2 degrees, or whether they have heating, whether they have enough fuel, electricity that actually works, gas supply? Will somebody die during the summer? Does this depend on a change of 1 or 2 degrees, or does it depend on whether they have access to air conditioning? If sea levels were to rise a few inches over many decades, we could just move if we really had to. 1/3 of the Netherlands is below sea level, and they're doing fine. So will the ability to produce enough food for the growing human population, is this going to depend on small changes in climate or on access to tractors, fertilizer, transportation, refrigeration, food processing and canning plants, and that sort of thing? Obviously, the most important factor is the technological improvements that we bring to agriculture, not a small change in the climate. Even for large-scale problems like droughts, which are real, overall, weather and climate mean less to us now than they did 100 years ago. Extreme weather means less to us now than it did 100 years ago. Geography means less to us now than it did 100 years ago, because we're not limited to what nature happens to have cooked up by the time we came on the scene. We can improve all of this. Drainage systems mean that heavy rain doesn't matter as much. We don't blame road flooding or subway flooding on climate change. We shouldn't. We blame it on politicians and ourselves for not forcing investment in enough maintenance, drainage systems, flood control. That's why we have flooding. We're able to control it. So this is an overall concept that I think is very much missing, and people end up getting pulled in by these, silly little things. Like, here's an example, plastic. Okay, people say plastic is bad for the environment. Well, I'll tell you what, plastic is actually very good for, it depends on who you ask. If you ask elephants, plastic is wonderful. In the 1800s, tens of thousands of elephants were killed every year to send tusks for ivory to British silverware manufacturing plants. In Europe and the United States together, there were 2 million pounds of ivory consumed every year, the tusks of 160,000 elephants late in the 19th century. What happened? Was it environmental regulations? A shortage of elephants? Partly. The big thing was plastic. There's no need to kill an elephant to take its tusks if you can just use plastic to make, pool balls or knives or, whatever it is that you're making. Plastic saved the elephants. Plastic saved the tortoises. No more tortoise shell for combs, glasses, this sort of thing. Millions of turtles were killed to make things out of, and now you can just use plastics. As far as the ban on straws and the war on plastic bags, less than 1% of the plastic waste in the oceans is plastic bags. Using anything besides plastic bags uses way more resources. Most of what's there is fishing material, nets and things like that, and most of what comes from the land comes from China, Indonesia, Vietnam, the Philippines. A lot of that plastic that people worry about being in the ocean, it came because you wanted to recycle. We recycle plastics. Nobody has anything to do with them. They're shipped over they used to be shipped to China, where maybe they'd just wind up in the ocean. So, the idea that we're going to save the planet by, banning straws is ridiculous. The way to keep oceans clean is development. What kind of trash service exists in poor nations? What kind of waste disposal overall? Development. That's the way that you can have a nice environment and you can have development. There's no contradiction. In fact, it's entirely the opposite. Look, let's talk about the use of land in the United States. Let's talk about how petroleum is great for land, okay? When the United States moved from using mules and horses and, animals to help on the farms and moved to using tractors and combine harvesters instead, we freed up a whole lot of land that was just growing food for animals. The size of that land? Equal in size to California. That's how much land we no longer had to dedicate to producing essentially fuel to power a horse. Instead, you use petroleum to power a tractor. Way better, way more efficient, way higher energy density. Coal itself, then, has twice the energy as wood, pound per pound. But when you look at the actual way that it's produced, a coal mine has 25,000 times the power output, the power density as a forest. 25,000 times. Another example, whales. Greenpeace made a big show in 1975 of opposing whaling. They were big heroes at, going after whaling ships. Just to take whales as for example, in the middle of the 19th century, in the middle of the 1800s, 600,000 barrels of whale oil were produced annually. People loved whale oil. It burned clean. You could make candles and things out of it. You could burn it directly. It was just a great product. By 1900, whaling was down by 90%. Why? Because of petroleum. Way more efficient to get oil out of the ground than to hunt down whales and then melt down their blubber to make oil. I mean, you think about that. Isn't that crazy? But then whaling came back. Whale oil was used to make margarine, to make soaps, until palm oil replaced it. Whales were still used, their baleen was used to make corsets. But with plastics and then changing fashions, that disappeared. Whaling peaked in 1962. 75,000 whales killed every year for oil, baleen, these kinds of things. It was already on its way down by the time Greenpeace made a big stink. And they didn't stop it. What stopped it was the fact that there's no need to hunt down whales for things that you could just make other ways even better. Fish overall. Today, fish farming produces half of the fish consumed by people on the planet. In fact, it's kind of weird that we go out and hunt fish in the oceans, go around looking for them. We don't do that with other things. We don't hunt chickens. We grow them, right? We don't hunt cows. We raise them. We don't hunt lettuce or go scavenging for lettuce, looking around in the woods for it. We grow it on a farm. So, this transformation from looking for resources out there in nature to producing them ourselves, we're way more effective at producing them. And that's why limits to resources is an imaginary, it's really an imaginary idea, because we're able to produce things in new ways. One of the biggest new ways of overcoming limits is nuclear power. Nuclear power is extremely safe, safest form of power. Safer than hydro, safer than coal, safer than natural gas, safer than windmills, safer than solar panels. It's extremely efficient, nuclear power. It requires very little land, very little mining, not just compared to coal, where you have to mine the fuel for a coal power plant or a nuclear plant, but even a solar panel. You got to mine all the material you're making these solar panels out of. It uses like a dozen times more material than a nuclear plant and way more waste. What about the threat of nuclear power? Maybe 30 people died at Chernobyl immediately when that plant had its issue. Another 20 or so over the following years. And the expectation is that maybe another 100 people will die from thyroid cancer that otherwise they wouldn't have had were it not for the Chernobyl disaster. So, like 200 people dying. People have the image, it would be better if it were none, obviously, but people have the idea that nuclear plants are bombs or something like this, that a plant might explode, like the way the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki did. Completely ridiculous, totally impossible. People who say this, many of them know that they're lying. And then think about nuclear waste. The great thing about nuclear waste, there's barely any of it. You could fit all the nuclear waste in a football field, at the height of about 70 feet tall. That's not a lot, and it's not dangerous at all. If Germany, instead of throwing away $580 billion on solar and wind and having the most expensive Europe, having extremely expensive electricity as a result, if Germany had put that money in nuclear, they'd actually reach their CO2 targets because they wouldn't be emitting any CO2, leaving aside whether that's an issue, and they'd have a reliable energy supply. Here's another example of how crazy this war on nuclear is. In Vermont, the lunatic environmentalist Bill McKibben and Bernie Sanders, they got the Vermont legislature to commit in 2005 to reduce emissions 25% below 1990 levels by 2012, and by 50% by 2028. But Vermont, unlike the U.S. as a whole, carbon dioxide emissions have risen in Vermont, 16% above the 1990 level by 2015. Why? Because they shut down the nuclear power station. So why would anybody opposed to CO2 also oppose nuclear? What's really going on here? Back in 1966, the Sierra Club did not oppose the Diablo Canyon nuclear plant in California that's recently been taken. They didn't oppose it. They said this is a power source that's efficient, uses very little land, doesn't involve a lot of mining. We're not going to oppose this. So then what happened? Overall, there was a decision that we are not going to have abundant power. We are not going to have development in the world. Some of the flavors that this took in the United States was, for example, Ralph Nader in 1974 saying that a nuclear accident could wipe out Cleveland. Bullshit. And that the survivors would envy the dead. Just total nonsense. Jane Fonda was in this stupid movie, The China Syndrome, in which there was a scientist or an actor pretending to be a scientist, but actually in a movie. This person said that an accident could render an area the size of the state of Pennsylvania permanently uninhabitable. That's totally impossible. The Simpsons, these ridiculous ideas of nuclear. Or Fukushima. Thousands of people died from unnecessary evacuation, from cold, from the cold, it was cold and people didn't have electricity because the country shut down all the nuclear plants, from air pollution and the increased burning of coal. No one died from that nuclear plant. And how many died from the tsunami triggered by the earthquake? So these interruptible energy sources, wind, solar, they're unreliable, they're systemically wasteful, they're impossible to store in a big way. People claim it. It's just not true. Absolutely not true. And completely wasteful. If we wanted to replace all the petroleum in the United States that we use with ethanol made from corn, the amount of corn that we'd have to plant just for ethanol would be 50% more land than all current U.S. cropland. All U.S. cropland plus 50% to make the ethanol to replace our petroleum. It's insane. Totally insane. So the shift occurred, and LaRouche identified this very directly, this shift that occurred at the late 60s, early 70s, a few inflection points in this process of bringing back the ideas of, well, not bringing back, but bringing to a new prominence the ideas of Thomas Malthus, the British liar who said that it was impossible to support the planet's population and that poor people should be encouraged to die since there's just nothing in the world for them. 1968, The Population Bomb book came out. 1970, an essay called Lifeboat Ethics, where the author said that even if we're thinking that we're humanitarian, every life of an Indian that we save through medical or nutritional assistance from abroad, that diminishes the quality of life for those who remain and for subsequent generations. They said that Earth is a lifeboat with limited capacity, and it would be cruel to try to bring in more people and sink it. Instead, the ethical thing is to let them drown. In 1972, the Club of Rome published The Limits to Growth, where they argued that it was impossible to continue growing and that population control and development curbs had to be implemented, that the developing world simply never could become wealthy, that this was unacceptable. It would destroy the planet. Now, LaRouche opposed this. He wrote the book, There Are No Limits to Growth, where he identified the pedigree of Thomas Malthus, where he explained why there are no limits to resources because human beings create resources. They're not natural things floating out there. Uranium isn't a resource until we know what we can do with it. Whales aren't a resource. Whales were not used to make margarine, 500 years ago. That's a kind of a silly example. But we create these things. And the fact that people are opposed to nuclear, what this came from was opposed to people. Paul Ehrlich, who after a trip to India complained about how many people there were, he said that here's a quote, giving society cheap, abundant energy at this point, meaning nuclear, would be the moral equivalent of giving an idiot child a machine gun. In 1980, the Carter administration's Global 2000 report said that in the year 2000, human beings would be more vulnerable to the environment and poorer. Totally untrue, right? So what came out of this was the idea of appropriate technology, of sustainable development, meaning a little bit of charity, but overall countries that are not now in supposedly developed conditions are just going to have to stay that way. They'll get appropriate technology. So we'll give a village, some solar panels to put on their roof, to charge an LED light so you can do your homework for a couple hours at night. Or the disgusting Barack Obama, who was promoting his Power Africa plan, which did absolutely nothing, and talked about a soccer ball called the socket, where you kick the ball around, there's a little generator inside, and then it can power a light at night for you to do your homework. Just grotesque. The idea that this is an appropriate thing for human beings, kick around a ball and you can see for a little bit at night, how's that going to power industry? How's that going to power a hospital? With soccer ball generators? It's disgusting, right? But these people, they don't stop. 2019, Bill McKibben said that climate change is, quote, the greatest challenge humans have ever faced. This is a greater challenge than going to the moon. the Black Death, the Holocaust, World War II, HIV, AIDS, COVID, climate change is the greatest challenge? How about eliminating poverty? Shouldn't that be a great challenge for us to face? So part of the idea that gets people with this religious, reverence for an unsullied nature really comes in parallel to the development of cybernetics, something else that LaRouche really attacked. Cybernetics, based on the idea of self-regulating systems. Nature is not a self-regulating system. In some ways, there's feedback loops, but overall, the natural world, the biosphere, let's say, is a developing system. Over evolutionary time, things haven't stayed the same. When animals made the move from the oceans to land, were there environmentalists with signs protesting, saying, stay in the ocean? Don't dirty the land is, just for bacteria. You should stay off. No animals up here. No. It grew. It developed. The number of elements commonly used by life increased. The level of energy intensity of the life on Earth increased. It's a developing system. It changes all the time. We can make it much better than it is today, and we do that. That's why we're less susceptible to climate than we were 100 years ago. So what's our view towards the future? Are we part of a death cult, or do we see people sucked into a death cult that's almost hoping for Armageddon, hoping for a destruction of everything, maybe not seeing anything great worth keeping the human species around for? Or are we able to express a love for the future based on an understanding, an optimism, and an intention for what the human species could be, for what we are able to accomplish? So there's no need to be the least bit defensive about this. This green stuff is nothing to be defensive about. We need enormous growth. We need a global Glass-Steagall, a reorganization or a replacement of the Bretton Woods institutions, a new Bretton Woods. The World Bank, which had helped Brazil build up its energy infrastructure, including hydro, now refuses to help countries build these kinds of things. This is just terrible. The whole green genocide outlook has to be crushed. There are ideologues who actually buy into this stuff, but at the top, this is the Malthusian imperial ideology that humanity has fought in various ways for millennia. Against this outlook that the American Revolution was waged and won. Growth and happiness are good, and they come together. Human beings, we're the greatest, we're the best form of life that we know of. We can be loving, creative, empathetic with each other. We create resources. We set our own limits, or maybe better said, we've repeatedly broken any limits to our development, and there's no reason to think that we're done. The Great Reset, this is to be eliminated by recognizing the power of each person, that potential for development of each person, the dignity and the value of each person, and using a global health system as a driver for the industrialization and infrastructure platforms that are going to be needed to deliver it, and that will be needed to have an industrial base to be able to support a world in which people are able to achieve meaningful lives, including, of course, health, but also beyond that, mental outlook, education, social organization, community. We've got a great future ahead of us if we choose to make it happen. And the only apocalypse that we're not facing an apocalypse of Greta Thunberg yelling at us, climate change tipping points, or the Earth getting 2 degrees hotter instead of 1.5 degrees hotter. If that's even happening, and we can talk about that in the Q&A. I haven't addressed that, but there's really a lot of reasons not to believe these projections anyway. But is 2 degrees of warming, even if that were to happen, is that a threat in a world with nuclear power and air conditioners? Or is our real threat that of nuclear war or being clobbered by an asteroid? Because we're sitting around here being schmucks arguing about this stuff, and our chemical and solar-powered rockets are not going to be able to deflect an asteroid in time to prevent it from destroying life on Earth. That would be an apocalypse. Using straws, using fossil fuels is not, and it's used as a new form of colonialism to prevent development and to enforce a fascism and a reduction of living standards in the so-called developed world. And really, it's kind of an insult to say that any country is a developed nation. I think we've all got a lot more developing to do. So this is given the blackouts that we've seen we had what occurred in Texas in the winter. We've had blackouts in Europe, blackouts in the United States. The increasing use of interruptibles, so-called renewables, is making our energy systems more and more unreliable, increasingly prone to failure, and increasing electricity rates along the way. And so this is an opportunity to just have a confrontation with reality, that this ideological push for power sources that just don't work is running into a wall, and we have a message to share that we do not need to try to use these garbage energy sources. We should move forward with nuclear, and as we build up the industrial capability to produce nuclear in bulk, which right now we can't just churn them out that quickly, we should feel totally free to build coal plants and build natural gas plants. They're fine. So I'm going to wrap it up with that, Dennis.